The intuitive introvert, within Carl Gustav Jung's complex framework of psychological types, stands apart, not just because of its scarcity, but due to the profound psychological burden it carries. Jung's analysis suggests this personality type represents one of the most challenging psychological configurations to comprehend, both for external observers and for the individuals themselves. This is not a type driven by external action, empirical facts, or observable emotional displays. Instead, it operates through connection to a symbolic current that flows from the unconscious depths, guided by internal imagery, presentiments, and archetypal formations that remain invisible to conventional perception. This psychological type doesn't function through sequential reasoning or empirical methodology. Its orientation is fundamentally internal. It perceives meanings that haven't yet crystallized, senses psychological movements before they reach conscious awareness, and maintains profound sensitivity to dimensions hidden from ordinary sight. The material world, with its practical requirements and logical frameworks, often appears trivial or meaningless to this type. This isn't from arrogance or disengagement, but because their attention naturally gravitates toward different planes of experience, a symbolic realm that frequently anticipates temporal reality. For them, concrete facts serve as shadows of more essential truths, still gestating in unconscious depths. Jung characterized this type as someone who perceives what is approaching but hasn't yet manifested. This represents perception oriented toward potential, toward psychological possibility, toward formations emerging from collective unconscious layers. This mode of functioning renders the intuitive introvert exceptionally sensitive to cultural, spiritual, and existential transformations that announce themselves before becoming visible to others. However, this sensitivity, regardless of its power, exacts a significant psychological price. The surrounding world operates on fundamentally different frequencies. Society demands evidence, measurable results, objective validation. What this type perceives, by its essential nature, remains intangible, at least initially. This creates a profound chasm between internal perception and external expectations. Their insights are frequently dismissed, ignored, or pathologized. They represent the kind of individual who intuits something crucial about a person they've just encountered, who senses atmospheric shifts before events unfold, who perceives outcomes long before facts provide confirmation. Yet, when they attempt to communicate these perceptions, they almost invariably encounter silence or rejection. Over time, they learn to maintain silence, to preserve their inner world as a private and impenetrable sanctuary. It is precisely within this silence that genuine danger begins to emerge. Jung issued a clear warning. When this type fails to discover methods for translating their visions into language, artistic expression, or concrete action, they risk being consumed by the very images they perceive. The inner world, which should serve as a source of revelation, transforms into a psychological prison. Symbolic images, when not integrated into conscious awareness, begin exerting autonomous control over the psyche, and the individual ceases to be one who contemplates. They become one who is possessed by the imagery itself. This is where Jung's dark warning takes definitive shape. The gift of profound intuition, when not properly balanced, can transform into a process of psychological dissociation. The nature of introverted intuition. Within Jung's typological framework, intuition is classified as one of the irrational psychological functions. meaning a form of perception that operates independently of logical reasoning or sensory experience. However, in the case of the introverted intuitive type, this function assumes a deeply internalized orientation. Unlike extroverted intuition, which seeks possibilities within the external environment, introverted intuition turns inward toward unconscious depths. It captures not what is visible, but what emerges from the more primitive and symbolic layers of the psyche, frequently without warning, context, or immediate rational explanation. Jung described this function as the capacity to perceive raw psychological imagery, symbolic forms that haven't yet undergone transformation into thought, emotion, or action. The introverted intuitive type exists in constant contact with these images. They don't see with physical eyes, but with what might be called the eyes of the soul. What appears as an ordinary situation to others may carry hidden meanings, invisible tensions, patterns that repeat in silence for this type. Their mind functions like an antenna oriented inward, receiving signals that possess no conventional language, yet carry weight, form, and psychological energy. This sensitivity, when properly integrated, becomes a powerful source of insight. The introverted intuitive can perceive the profound meaning of events, understand the unconscious motivations driving others, and anticipate changes before they become perceptible to conventional awareness. However, this same sensitivity renders them vulnerable to internal dispersion, since the sensation function, responsible for maintaining contact with present reality and physical embodiment, is often the most underdeveloped in this type. They can easily drift away from objective reality. Intuition then begins functioning autonomously, disconnected from practical experience, and the individual becomes lost in an ocean of internal imagery. This inner architecture is not chaotic, but neither is it controllable. Symbolic images arise from psychological necessity rather than conscious choice. When properly directed, these visions can become seeds of creation, ideas that transform, symbols that heal, narratives that reveal. But if they remain ununderstood and unprocessed, they can accumulate as psychological noise, leading to confusion, paralysis, and the collapse of rational functioning. The individual then begins living not in the world, but in a kind of self-reinforcing parallel reality. For the introverted intuitive, understanding the workings of their own intuitive function represents the first step toward avoiding enslavement by it. They must learn to distinguish what constitutes revealing symbolism from what represents baseless fantasy. This requires time, silence, and internal structure, but it also demands awareness of a crucial warning. Regardless of how fascinating this internal world may be, it contains psychological traps, the prophetic burden, and its isolation. Introverted intuition possesses a characteristic that renders it simultaneously fascinating and psychologically dangerous. It doesn't operate within present temporal frameworks. Its nature is oriented toward what is approaching, toward that which doesn't yet exist, but insinuates itself at the periphery of consciousness. The introverted intuitive type lives as though inhabiting the threshold between now and not yet. They sense the approach of events, perceive archetypal shifts in psychological and cultural fabric before these manifest in concrete form. This capacity for anticipation renders them, in Jung's words, similar to prophetic figures, individuals who perceive what others cannot yet see. But there exists a fundamental dilemma in this psychological position. What is seen cannot be empirically proven. What is felt cannot be justified through facts, and what is intuited rarely finds resonance in others. This creates constant conflict between the inner clarity of vision and the absence of external recognition. The introverted intuitive begins doubting themselves, or alternatively, takes refuge in their perception with such absolute conviction that they reject the world around them. In both cases, the tension between the perceived invisible and the denied visible begins corroding the psyche. One of the most illuminating examples Jung cited involves a patient who described, during the analytical process, the image of a black serpent lodged within her abdomen. As treatment progressed, this serpent began ascending within her body until it emerged from her mouth and transformed into a snake with a golden head. For many, this would appear as delusional fantasy, but Jung interpreted the image as a clear symbol of inner transformation, a process of individuation taking visual form through unconscious expression. The black serpent represented repressed content that, when integrated, was reborn as a symbol of healing. This example accurately illustrates the functioning of introverted intuition. It doesn't communicate through logic, but through imagery. It doesn't point to causes, but reveals destinies. The problem arises when these images fail to find external language, when the symbol is not translated into creation, reflection, or action. At this point, the vision, once revealing, begins closing in upon itself. The mind loses the capacity to distinguish what constitutes insight from what represents illusion, and what was symbolic wisdom becomes solitary delirium. The boundary between revelation and delusion is extremely subtle, and the introverted intuitive walks upon it daily. For intuition not to transform into a psychological labyrinth, it becomes essential to understand which mechanisms can lead to a rupture with reality. The danger of archetypal inflation. The intuitive introverted type is, by psychological structure, a solitary individual, not by preference, but by inherent psychic configuration. Their attention is directed toward what cannot be seen, toward what has not yet taken shape, toward that which emerges from the unconscious in symbols, visions, and premonitions. However, this inner orientation, when it fails to find means of expression or mediation with the external world, creates fertile ground for identity crises and, in more extreme cases, for delusions of grandeur. Jung termed this process inflatio, the moment when the ego becomes inflated by unconscious contents and begins identifying with powerful archetypes without recognizing its limitations. This phenomenon occurs subtly. The intuitive introverted individual, through perceiving deep symbolic patterns, may begin believing they have been chosen for a special mission. This sense of uniqueness, although initially legitimate as a reflection of their sensitivity, can transform into messianic illusion. The individual begins seeing themselves as a bearer of absolute truths, an unrecognized visionary, a prophet rejected by a blind society. Criticism from others is interpreted as persecution. Doubt is viewed as a sign of others' inferiority. Isolation deepens not as a consequence, but as justification. No one understands me because I am more evolved. This type of psychological inflation is dangerous because it dissolves self-criticism. The individual begins living within their own symbolic narrative, with no clear distinction between what constitutes archetypal content and what represents concrete reality. They identify with images from the unconscious, the wise one, the martyr, the prophet, and lose contact with their ordinary humanity. This over-identification with archetypes leads to psychological fragmentation. The intuitive function, which once offered glimpses of meaning, transforms into a vehicle of escape. Practical life is neglected, relationships become merely instrumental, and any contradiction is rejected as a threat to the inner vision. Jung observed that this pattern was common in personalities that emotionally isolated themselves and resisted any form of adaptation to the world. The greater danger, according to him, was not the isolation itself, but what followed afterward, the complete colonization of consciousness by the unconscious. When this occurs, the ego ceases to mediate reality and becomes merely a passive receptacle of symbolic images. Perception becomes distorted, judgment is contaminated, and existence begins moving in a subtly delirious fantasy realm where everything seems to make sense, but nothing is rooted in the real. Still, not every contact with the symbol leads to collapse. There is an antidote, and it begins with the capacity for expression, the ability to translate the invisible into form, word, gesture, or art. When the symbolic vision finds a way to exit the private sphere and manifest in the world, it transforms from prison into creation. The necessity of symbolic expression, the psychological survival of the intuitive introverted type, depends largely on their ability to transform the invisible into tangible form. For Jung, the unexpressed symbol tends to become an autonomous agent within the psyche, acting as a foreign body that has not been digested by consciousness. The only way to integrate these internal images is by offering them contour in the external world. Symbolic expression, whether through art, writing, music, or ritual practices, is not an aesthetic luxury. It is a vital necessity. This process of translating the symbol into reality is what differentiates the creative visionary from the fragmented mystic. When the intuitive introverted type finds a way to externalize their perceptions, they transform their symbolic solitude into communication, their strangeness into language, their isolation into impact. What was an internal labyrinth becomes a shareable map. This act of creation has a dual effect. It not only relieves internal psychological tension, but also offers the collective access to contents that were previously only in the unconscious. History is filled with examples of figures who most likely operated from this intuitive introverted function. Franz Kafka, with his labyrinthine and dreamlike texts, channeled his symbolic alienation into works that still capture the absurdity of modern existence. Vincent van Gogh, unable to adapt to the practical world, poured his emotional and symbolic vision into explosive brushstrokes, each painting a desperate attempt to translate a boiling soul. Even Jung himself, who recognized this type within his own psychology, wrote his deepest works as attempts to translate complex internal experiences into comprehensible systems. But it is not merely about genius or talent. What these examples demonstrate is that symbolic expression is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world. When this bridge does not exist, the symbol accumulates, closes in on itself, and begins distorting the perception of reality. But when there is a way out, the inner image becomes work, gesture, word, and this reorganizes the psyche. The intuitive function ceases operating in darkness and begins collaborating with consciousness. Creativity, then, is not just a gift, it is a process of psychological integration. However, even the richest symbolic expression may not be sufficient if there is no grounding in reality. The intuitive introverted type, by their structure, tends to neglect the body, routine, and concrete limitations. and this exposes them to new risks. Creation can become compulsion. Inspiration can turn into escape. True integration only happens when the symbol also finds a sensory basis, when intuition is balanced by sensation. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The integration of sensation, grounding the vision. The intuitive function, especially in its introverted form, operates outside of temporal constraints, physical embodiment, and linear progression. It dives into the unconscious, gathers symbols and premonitions, and returns to the surface carrying visions that do not belong to the concrete world. This ability is what gives the introverted intuitive type its enigmatic brilliance, but it is also what weakens it. Without an anchor, without solid foundation in the present, this intuition risks becoming a psychological whirlpool. That is why Jung emphasized the importance of integrating the inferior function. Sensation. Sensation is the function responsible for keeping us connected to the now, to the body, to the material world. It perceives what is tangible, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the bitter taste of coffee, the weight of an object in the hands. For the introverted intuitive, who tends to neglect these perceptions as mundane or irrelevant, sensation seems almost like a foreign language. But it is precisely this language that can provide the antidote to excessive abstraction. It is in the materiality of simple things that this type can find balance. In walking, cooking, tending to plants, practicing manual crafts, or simply maintaining routine. The return to the body, to routine, and to present time does not deny symbolic depth. It sustains it. When the type manages to alternate between intuitive diving and concrete practice, their visions cease to be labyrinths and become roots. They become capable of moving between worlds, the internal and the external, the invisible and the tangible. This transit is what characterizes true psychological maturity. The symbol then ceases to be an object of passive contemplation and transforms into a real guiding force that shapes life decisions and relationships, not as an oracle, but as a compass. Everyday rituals assume, in this context, a therapeutic function. They do not need to be grand or esoteric. They can be as simple as lighting a candle at dawn, writing in a notebook at the end of the day, or intentionally organizing a workspace. These small acts create an axis in the internal chaos. They are gestures that tell the unconscious. There is order, there is body, there is reality. It is in this ritualized space that the symbol can descend to earth without exploding the psyche. The integration of sensation is not a limitation. It is what allows intuition to flourish more strongly. But even when there is symbolic expression and anchoring in the real, the introverted intuitive type faces a final challenge: living their truth in a world that generally rejects everything that cannot be measured, explained, or monetized. How to sustain their vision in an environment dominated by logic, productivity, and immediacy. How to continue listening to internal symbols when the external world demands obedience to the concrete. This is the final clash. The final clash. Living symbolically in a material world. Even when the intuitive introverted type develops means of symbolic expression and builds practices of anchoring in reality, they still face an obstacle that few perceive, and which may be the hardest of all: sustaining their own inner truth in a world that systematically rejects the invisible. Modern culture, focused on the concrete, the immediate, and the measurable, values objective results, statistical data, productivity, and visible performance. Deep intuitions, symbolic visions, and silent reflections are not only ignored, they are often ridiculed, pathologized, or dismissed as irrelevant. For the intuitive introverted individual, this creates constant tension between fidelity to their own soul and the need to adapt. At every moment, they find themselves faced with a choice: betray their inner vision to fit into the collective discourse, or remain true to themselves even if it means marginalization, misunderstanding, and loneliness. This choice is not theoretical. It presents itself in the details of everyday life, in conversations where they need to silence what they truly think, in environments where their silence is interpreted as weakness, in jobs where they cannot express what they see, feel, or sense under the threat of being considered inappropriate. But this tension does not have to lead to resignation. Jung argued that the process of individuation requires exactly this: sustaining the symbolic core of the self, even amidst the opposing forces of collectivity. Living one's symbolic truth for the intuitive introverted individual is not withdrawing from the world. It is navigating through it without losing the internal axis. It is knowing that the vision they carry may never be fully recognized, yet still needs to be lived, because in the end, the function of intuition is not to please, convince, or win. It is to point to paths that do not yet exist. Living symbolically in a materialistic society is a silent act of resistance. It is choosing depth over appearance, meaning over convenience. It is sustaining a connection with the invisible, even when everything around says it has no value. But this type, when they find the courage to remain true to what they see, becomes a transformative figure, not by imposing themselves on the world, but by revealing with their presence that there is something beyond the surface. This revelation, no matter how subtle, has the power to touch, disturb, and inspire those who are ready to perceive. If you feel that you belong to this invisible world, if you live among symbols, intuitions, and premonitions that few understand, share in the comments how you have dealt with this crossing. What strategies have you found to remain whole? How do you balance the inner world with external reality? Your response may help others who live the same silent dilemma. And don't forget to watch the next video. It may be the natural continuation of this reflection and may offer the missing key to deepen this dive even further. It's important. See you there.